From the News Channel 5 network, this is Urban Outlook.
Hello and welcome to Urban Outlook. I'm April Eaton. Thank you so much for being with us today. A new exhibit at the Tennessee State Museum captures the lives of the slaves and the slave owners who worked and lived and operated a plantation not too far from here in Robertson, Tennessee. The exhibit is called Slaveholders of Wessyngton Plantation. It gives a glimpse of what it was like during those times for the enslaved African Americans and their white owners on that 13,000-acre plantation. It's a fascinating exhibit because it is all based on a book by an author, John Baker, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation. This is the book, and I want to tell you about this author, about this picture, and how this all came about when he was a 7th grader in school. So let's welcome to the show John F. Baker, who is the author of the book, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, and also the State Museum curator, who's always a fan for us here, Rob DeHart, who is the exhibit curator for this particular one, but has been with us from time to time to talk about some other exhibits over there at the Tennessee State Museum. Welcome both of you to the show.
Thank you.
So I want to start kind of with this very first picture, and if Mary Elena, if we can pull that up, and that's the one that's on the cover here. John, talk a little bit about this and how this all came about when you were just a 7th grader, how this sparked not only this book, but this whole exhibit that's at the museum.
When I was in the 7th grade, we used a social studies textbook called Your Tennessee, and flipping through the book, I found this photograph of 4 former slaves. And for some reason, I seemed to be drawn to it, thinking they resembled individuals that I had seen before, but at the time, I didn't have a clue that I was actually staring at my own great-great-grandparents. So shortly after we got out of school for summer break, the local newspaper ran a feature article about the plantation, and they had a photograph of the white Washington family that owned the plantation, and they had the same one that was in our social studies textbook. So my grandmother was visiting from Chicago and spent the weekend with one of her older brothers. And so she called my mom and told her to come pick her up, have me to bring a camera because she had something she wanted me to photograph. And so when I got there, she showed me the newspaper article of the photograph, and I remembered it from my 7th grade social studies book. And I said, "Grandmother, this picture is in our history book. Who is this?" And she told me that the couple seated were her grandparents, Emanuel and Henny Washington, who had been born slaves on Wessyngton Plantation.
Wow.
So I interviewed other members of our family, and I interviewed as well descendants of some of the other slaves from the plantation, about 20 to 25 individuals that ranged in age from 80 to 107 years old. And they gave me their stories, and over a 30-year period, I did research at the Tennessee State Library and Archives here in Nashville, and compiled all this information. And then I wrote the book in 2006, and it was published in 2009.
John, it's amazing that you were drawn to the picture because the features look like somebody you knew.
Right, my grandmother resembled her grandmother.
Did you ever imagine that it would explode to such a powerful, powerful story and experience for you? Because those are your family members.
Right, I had no idea at the time that I was collecting the information that it would lead to the book and the exhibit. Other things.
Wow. And let's talk a little bit about that exhibit, because I know you hear this story. I have chills just listening to how this all came about. But what goes through your mind when you hear the history of that photo, that young man sitting in that school desk in his classroom in 7th grade, and how it has materialized into an exhibit that's there at the Tennessee State Museum?
Well, John's commitment to this story is what made the exhibit. We couldn't have done it without him in this book. When we were looking for a way to do an exhibit on plantation slavery, John's book was an automatic one that we wanted to work with, mainly because of the depth of the information that is there. And what John did so well is he shows how enslaved people built lives within bondage. A lot of times when we talk about slavery, we talk about it in vague terms. We don't know a whole lot about the people. But with John's, you really get to know those people, and you get to know what they went through before, during, and after the Civil War, and what happened to their children afterwards. So I think this exhibit, based on this book, has been very enlightening to a lot of people because of the depth of the stories that are involved.
Rob, this is a tough story to tell, right? And John, you pipe in here as well. But when you talk about slavery, it's sometimes a message, a story, an experience that people don't want to relive because of the things that happened during slavery, right? But it is part of our history. That's the bottom line, I guess some might say.
Absolutely. We knew that the exhibit had the potential to be controversial because people do go into discussions of slavery with preconceived ideas of what they think about it. That was a concern, but at the same time, it's really all of our story. It's the same way that we approach this as not being purely a Black history exhibit. It's a Tennessee history exhibit. You can't talk about the history of Tennessee without talking about slavery. And I think we achieved that goal with this exhibit.
I wonder, John, also if one of the interesting parts of this is not only is this the story of your family, but others who were enslaved on that plantation, but also the stories of those slave owners. How did you rectify? How did you get past the fact that you not only had to deal with what your ancestors dealt with, but you had to deal with the fact that somebody owned them and they had to work for somebody else?
Right. When I first started research, my great uncle, who knew my great-great-grandparents personally, told me that descendants of the white Wessyngton family, the slave owners, still lived at Wessyngton. So I called them up and told them that I'd seen the newspaper article and I was interested in my family's history there. So they gladly shared information as far as slave birth records. They also informed me that the family had deposited all their records in the Tennessee State Library and Archives in the 1960s. This is on 69 rolls of microfilm, some 11,000 documents. So many of the stories that I was able to get from direct descendants of the slaves, as far as which slaves ran away, some of them made it almost a free territory. This was supported by documentation in the Wessyngton family papers, so I was very fortunate.
A couple of things strike me there. The first, the willingness of the family of the slave owners to be so open and to share. But secondly, the fact that they maintained all those records through the years. That's amazing as well.
Yes.
Would you say?
Yeah, I think we call them hoarders today. But basically,
in a good way.
In
hoarders.
a good way.
Yeah, hoarders of history.
But the Wessyngtons, they were meticulous record keepers, and somehow those records survived. It's just an amazing thing. I don't know of any other plantation in Tennessee that has the depth of the records they have. And I might add that what your other question, we gave a tour to a number of white Wessyngton descendants not too long ago for the exhibit, and I got the best thank you note from one of them. He just said, "Thank you for allowing us to reflect on our shared past." And I just thought that was the best way to think of it, because we didn't want the exhibit to be an us versus them, assessing blame, anything like that. And he just captured it so perfectly. That's what we wanted people to do, just reflect on this time in history, and that's what it's about.
You're shaking your head there, so you obviously agree with that point of view.
Yes, and the Wessyngtons held their first family reunion this year in June, and they toured the exhibit, and then they took a tour of Wessyngton, so I got to meet about 70 of them.
Wow.
So they were very appreciative for this story bringing their family together, because they had never gotten together before.
What's been the reaction to this exhibit thus far? What's been the reaction from, I'm curious, your family members, as you've kind of weave this history into a beautiful story of how they fought and worked for freedom, and then what's been the reaction from the public when they've come to see it?
Well, my family, they've been hearing about all this ever since I started 30-something years ago, so they're not surprised at much of the information. But some of the other descendants, many of them are surprised to find that their families who were enslaved purchased several hundred acres of the land that they were formerly enslaved on, that they became educators, that they founded the first church in our county, and other things. They're very surprised about that. Some of their ancestors actually fought in the Union Army for their freedom. So they're very surprised about all these things and proud of their accomplishments.
Right.
The reactions I usually get is we tell the story so straight down the center, in that we don't hide the brutality of what it was like, but we also show how they were able to build lives within this bondage. So what the reactions I usually get is that for the first time, they're able to see enslaved people as people that had lives and how they constructed those lives and what their relationships were like with their owners. And there's a lot of tension there. There's no doubt about it. There's resistance, there's control, but the exhibit brings that all about so that you get these three-dimensional characters and so many different levels of understanding.
Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to show some of the pieces, the pictures that we have of the exhibit to give people another glimpse of what it will be like if they show up, and then of course information on how they can see that exhibit as well. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us.